too hot. Tired of freaking boiling in this heat. I hope I don't have a cold. I hope I don't have a second round of Corona. That would suck. It's grossly hot. All right, so I think where we left it off last night was talking about the primary world of Verloren as the starting foundational world for my world build. I will say that the way I've built this out is I call them worlds, but I don't know that I should call them worlds so much as universes, because there is a sense that what I want to do is it's one of those things about multi-reality settings that I always found interesting. Like if you look at, I guess Spelljammer qualifies, and there's some of that I kind of want to look at and maybe play with. But if you look at, let's go back into some of the brainstorming I did for story plot elements before, where what I did was I took Stargate SG-1, and instead of doing different planets, I did different realities. The thing that comes up in a setting like that, where you have different, yawning all the time these days, as you have different realities, each reality that you pass into is a reality that has an Earth, a Moon, a Mars, a Jupiter. Maybe they have some different planets in those places. I don't know. But for every Earth, there are other planets in the solar system. And for every solar system that's there are different planetary systems around other stars in those settings. There's a whole universe. Well, I really wish I could stop doing that. There's a whole universe of other things out there in every one of those alternate realities. So there's a part of me when I'm thinking about doing my role-playing or novel writing setting for a fantasy set, the idea is that each of the first mothers is a self-contained universe. The implication is that you would arrive on a planet like Earth, or in this case it would be the worlds. But here's the thing. If you enter those realms and find the life you have in those worlds, are they just worlds? Or are they whole universes with other planets as well? So if you wanted to do something like the Ray Gun Gothic story style, where Biff Hardslab, the hero of Earth, in his rocket ship travels to Venus to fight the Venusian Amazons. Like, a Ray Gun Gothic type setting has these other worlds with other beings on them. If we play with that same fantasy concept, it's not just one planet that you build per first mother. It's whole universes. And in those universes, it becomes a situation of a needles in a haystack situation, where if you reincarnate or are reborn or wake up in one of your vestiges, one of your bodies from another world, What are the odds that in an entire universe, 5 people who traveled together wake up in an entirely different universe, in entirely different bodies, all right next to each other? And what are the odds in doing so that they wake up not only next to each other in a world where they're all part of that same world, but the objects of their quest? Remember, we're going for like 3 quests here. The one of them is finding the first, finding any of the first mothers who could present themselves as a doorway with which to pass back into the. Uh, no, you're looking for the first mothers so that you can travel between worlds. You're also looking for Verloren, the first mother who leads back to the main realm that you started in. And 3, you're looking for ways to pass through physically and decide which of your forms is who you really choose to be. So there's sort of like 3 aspects. Like, what are the odds? Like, you can fudge some of the details here. So one of the things that we could potentially do is maybe there's more than one of you on every universe. So if you go into a universe and you wake in one of your bodies, maybe there are 29 other versions of you in that universe on different planets, or some may even be on the same planet as you. What are the odds that that's the case? But it still sort of causes a consequence of an indeterminate vastness that makes a weird coincidence of you all being in the same place, easily able to pursue further adventure together. I'm going to keep yawning all night. There's nothing I can do about it. So there is a little bit of that I question in that concept of like, how are we defining the worlds within the first mothers? Good God. Can you hear that thing? Sounds like a train. Anyway, so I'm a little not sure about some of that. There are a few things that have to be sort of met as a consequence, and that's established by circumstances that have to be set up correctly for some of the worlds I came up with. So the very first worlds that I came up with for this other reality aspect of this modularity of this setting, are the first 3. And that's Olean, Sira, and Orta. Orta is Oorta. And I got a lot of these names from just looking up world, land, realm, and Earth or planet or world in different languages, running it through Google Translate, and then taking what I got, just bending it a little bit so it sounds kind of like it could also be a character's name as well as the concept of a world. And each one of them has specifications that they need. One of them is based off of a story that I'd been writing for a while. It's based on a setting idea that I had, where you have the question of, like, mythologically speaking, Medusa is only ever referred to as a single female entity. She's one of the Gorgon sisters, which is a three sisters. Now, if I remember correctly, it's Medusa who's cursed with the form that she takes. The Gorgons weren't cursed, just Medusa was. But there's also stories in mythology of how her sisters resemble her, which that gets weird because it's another one of those things where, like, it depends on which version you're talking about. Some of them do that, some of them don't. But either way, that's traditional Greco-Roman mythology of Medusa. Now, if you take the same concept of Medusa in stories and fantasy, they're often referred to as one of a species of a kind of creature. But even then, they only ever refer to her or as she when confronting a Medusa. There's never a reference to a male Medusa. Now, there's an option available where if you want to, you can create that story. I do think one of the versions, I want to say it was 3 or 3.5, it might have even been second edition of D&D, created a male Medusa whose ability was to turn stone to flesh. He had no snakes for hair. He was bald with tattoos or something like that. It's like it was totally lame. It was a weird, unnecessary addition to the mythology. But the way I wanted to approach that story was like, all right, so let's build the idea of a Medusa species that don't have any men. What is that? What causes that? What is the history of that world? Well, the easy answer to a nerd like me who accumulates bits of information through all sorts of methods is to take a look at the idea of potentially doing a species that reproduces through parthenogenesis, which, when you talk about Greco-Roman mythology, parthenogenesis takes its meaning from Athena Parthenos, which was Athena sprang into existence directly from Zeus's head. He had a splitting headache, and it split his head open, and she emerged from it fully formed, and he healed up and whatever. He's a god, whatever. So she sprang fully formed as an adult from the head of Zeus. And so that her name is often Athena Parthenos. That's where the Parthenon gets some of its name from. So it shares a lot of those roots. But that term is also applied parthenogenesis, which is created in that same way, springing directly from an individual parent. So parthenogenesis tends to imply, well, it doesn't imply, it is a term that's used scientifically to suggest a species that can reproduce without mating. There are types of lizards, some types of fish, some invertebrates, and some lizards, especially, is what's important here, are able to reproduce this way. There's some insects, like the woodlouse, I think, is one of them. A woodlouse is able to, a female woodlouse is able to lay an egg that is not fertilized by an outside force, that will hatch into basically a duplicate of the mother who laid the egg. And if you did something to that effect with a Medusa to parthenogenically reproduce, seems very fitting. So I was working on a story setting and a story, a series of novels, outlines that I was building a while back, where the main character was one of these Medusas living in this world. Well, one of the other aspects of that world is you have to come to questions of like who was the first Medusa from which all the others sprang. And you want to have at least some genetic diversity. They can't all be the same thing. So at some point there was some reproduction through non-parthenogenic means. And one of the other things I wanted to be important to the story was to introduce genetic variants. So you could have, and the way I wrote the story was to have a species of Medusa type creature that is serpent from the waist down, but also have humanoid from the waist down, so legs, and also have the ability to have differences of like congenital conditions. So, like in humans, if two people carry a type of gene for a certain condition, it becomes a crapshoot of like if they both carry it and they both pass it on, their children may not be viable. If they both carry it and one passes it on and the other doesn't, that child may inherit that condition. So there are two choices for that. So one doesn't even get born. Two potentially have the same condition. And then there's the very occasional possibility of neither of the two of the parents pass on the trait. And so the child is born without that trait. And there are a few conditions like that. And one of the types that and possibly more than one type, I'd be curious to pursue is this is an opportunity to make a race of dwarfism. Not in the Norse mythological dwarf sense, but in the sense of dwarfism as a physical condition that can be passed on to your children. If you have somebody who's a Medusa and has this trait passed on to them, but then from that point on, they parthenogenically reproduce, you can generate an entire population of dwarf Medusas. Now, if you have human legs, serpent legs, dwarf human legs, dwarf serpent legs, you have 4 different sub-races of Medusa that you can play up with. And it's very much like humans, elves, dwarves, and gnomes or halflings. If you look at the Lord of the Rings setting, you have the elves, dwarves, halflings, and humans. And the orcs are a twisting or a manipulation or an alteration of elves. And so you could do some of those things. And so I was building a setting with that concept in mind. Now, if we start the story with the mother race of serpent goddess entity, not really a goddess in that sense, but the progenitor, who, as a consequence of certain actions, gets altered. Now, in the actual mythology, I don't care for the actual mythology of some of that. Like the cause of, you had 3 nymph sisters, and these nymphs were considered to be beautiful, and one of them was Medusa, and she was caught and raped by Poseidon in the temple to Athena. And Athena was so enraged that they defiled her temple like that she cursed Medusa to be hideous to behold to such a degree that anybody who beheld her turned to stone. I hate that. I hate that concept to its core. But twisting that a little bit in a different direction, in which you have the character of Medusa, who maybe has a lover in one of the first mothers, or an entity that travels from the Verloren realm. And she maybe strays from her lover and conceives children via this infidelity. The jealous lover imprisons her in the chaotic magic realm of Verloren by pulling her through a portal. And that exposure to the chaos there twists her to a new form. And so the children born from this exposure to this environment would be the first generation of Medusas. But I kind of feel like setting up the possibility of having the first Medusa still be serpentine to a certain degree. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure which direction to go. And the novel I was writing, that doesn't play as big a role as some of the other consequences. But they do hinge on the fact that they live in a world where there's no mammal species. And for the most part, I haven't decided whether or not the pack animals and other creatures on the continent that the story takes place on, if the dinosaurs they ride or whatever reptilian or bird-like creatures are their domesticated animals. I haven't decided whether or not any of those creatures have males in their population. It'll depend on the flavor of the story as it goes. Is it something that, like, a Medusa puzzles over the fact that, these species that they have in their environment may have a different way of existing? Is it some quirky thing they discover, or is it so common in the whole world that they're weird for being the only ones that don't have that method? But that's about that story. What we're looking at here is setting up a world in which doorways have been opened to other worlds. And theoretically, if we start with a serpentine creature and have a set of offspring that have humanoid legs. So if we start Medusa being serpentine from the waist down, and then further changed by her time in the realm of magic, the children she may have had would all be serpentine unless the other parent that introduces new genetic material to the strain was not serpentine. So in that sense, that question of, like, I referred to them in that story as beast men, because they see them as being like the animals because they are not like the Medusas. And so having this concept of these beast men, nobody sees them. Nobody's ever seen any because they're not a regular part of society. They're savage creatures from beyond the edge of our world. I set that up as, maybe when I was writing the outline originally for this story, I set it up as being from another continent. But maybe in the case of this story, for the setting that we're working on, we can change that to be they're from another world. Somebody from another world found ways to pass across to the world of Sira, which is the world that the Medusas take place in. Now, we could do that as Maybe they come from Olean, maybe they come from Orta or Mira or Lumia or Dunia. They can come from a lot of these worlds. It's also possible, remember what we said at the beginning of the episode, it's also possible to set it up so that they're from the Mars of their universe. So the humanoid came from Mars, and the serpentines live on Earth. So you don't have to pass through a portal into another universe. I don't think that's the way I'm going to go with this, because that doorways between worlds aspect is part of what we're building on for the campaign arc that would be played in games, or in the storytelling arc that I want to build for this cross worlds, Empyrean realms storyline. So that idea of having somebody who can pass between gates suggests there was a world in which other people had found ways to pass between worlds. So that these worlds are not as isolated as they think they are. Now, we have stuff similar to that in our world. We have the idea of the Fey realms. So don't step into a ring of mushrooms because it's a fairy ring, and if you step into that circle, you'll be transported to the fairy world. That same concept could play a role in two of these settings that link them together. Now, there are two other primary settings that I established of the first three that are subsets of the Verloran realm. So Verloran is the overarching, and then we had the three that I built underneath of that. There should be 6 all around it. The other 3 didn't come till later. And they're not as fully finalized either, I don't think. But the Sira is the one with the Medusa. The other one that's important for this piece of information is Orta, OORTA. It comes from I think the Ort is early Germanic word for earth, because it's earth, but instead of a th, it's a t. Instead of an air, it's a ur. So instead of earth, it's ort. But I added an A to it because it makes it sound a little bit more like a name. But Orta is a world in which everybody seems to be human, which suggests this is not the world from which the outsider came to the Medusa world. But everybody is human except for the fact that certain people develop superhuman abilities, don costumes, and fight to protect the civilians of their world. So the Avengers and that type of thing happens. And there's also monsters, but those monsters are people, are human beings. So they're born as human children. They're raised as human children. But at some point, they mutate, like the X-Men. But instead of becoming Hank McCoy the Beast, or Cyclops, or Colossus, or those types of things, they become ogres and harpies and trolls as their burgeoning change alters their form and makes them a monster. And in the X-Men Marvel Universe stories, oftentimes those characters are treated as freaks and dangerous, and they're discriminated against and feared. And that aspect fits the role that monsters play in D&D. They're a thing to be hunted and eliminated. They're considered dangerous and a threat to the societies that live in cities. And so that sort of concept is something I want to play with. But I've also established this as the comic book superhero of D&D. So it's not a role-playing game of superheroes. It is a Dungeons and Dragons setting that has superheroes in it. And part of that is looking at the idea of like, okay, so what kind of superheroes are there in the comics? There are the people who, there's Batman. He's got funding, he's got gadgets, and he's got training. You also have characters like Doctor Strange. He has studied magics that grant him abilities. You have people like, to a certain degree, Thor. Thor has a hammer that grants him abilities. I think there's probably a better example somewhere in the universe. It's just escaping me right now. So magical items that grant people abilities to do good. And then you have things like the Inhumans, which were ordinary people that react to a substance that will alter them. And then you have mutants who are not necessarily ordinary people. They're born to change. And then there's this sort of Shazam factor. You have people who, or Spider-Man is a good example of this one, where they encounter something that fundamentally changes them to grant them abilities to be heroes. All of those are different styles of heroism in the comic book genres. And I want to build a world that can have all of those. But there's also another type. And that other type is the Superman model. Martian Manhunter falls under that, and Captain Marvel. They're essentially, they are alien beings who are raised among humans or come to identify as part of human society. So in a world that I've built, the fantasy setting that I've built, where everybody's human, what's the equivalent of the planet of Krypton sending its last son to another world to be raised and develop strange powers under their alien sun? The equivalent of that is a Fey changeling. So if you take a realm with elves or fairies or whatever in it, and they are facing a cataclysm from which they will not recover, but they have the means to transport the last son of their realm to another world to be raised there and be a champion for those people. Kal-El is an elf. And so, or a dwarf, you could do a dwarf as well. But here's the thing. The reason I say an elf is because if we look at the idea of another place, another world where people live that is facing its own destruction, but people weren't paying attention or refused to believe that's actually what's going to happen, and thus nobody tried to save anybody from their world by trying to send them somewhere else, except for one couple who had the ability to send their child to another world. So they sent their child out through a portal to another world. So I'm thinking the Superman elf of Orta is from the same population that was the strange visitor to the world of Sira with the Medusa. And that makes a fair amount of sense. So those two suggest a third world in which there were Fey or Elvish people who had the ability to open doorways to other places. And at some point, there was a catastrophe that wiped out that world. So there's a third world out there that had predominantly only elves, but they're gone now. So it sort of requires that there has to be a world with access at least to two other worlds, and that has the ability to open those doorways between worlds, and had faced a calamity so severe that they are no longer there. That the elves on Horta and their half-elven or partially elven descendants in Sira are the remnants of those people. But there was a third world that I had already built for this setting, which is Olean. And Olean is a setting of two types. There's a before and an after in Olean. Olean was set up to be a zombie apocalypse type setting. So the appeal of that one for me is the Resident Evil, what is it, Dawn of the Dead? That sort of setting. I also wanted to do a little bit of what's the big one? Army of Darkness kind of thing with that setting, where you can start with a world with supernatural circumstances that eventually at some point one part of it goes too far and destroys the world. And so now you have these communities of people struggling in isolation, walls and fortressed into a little enclave of people, and the whole rest of the world is overrun with monstrous creatures that are terrifying. But these creatures are perhaps seen as alien to that world. But they can't be Fey, because they're not an elven consequence. But there is the possibility of them being the thing that destroyed the world of the elves. I'm not sure what the right way to broach that end piece would be, because this essentially makes four worlds. We have to have the zombie apocalypse world, the Medusa world, the superhero world, and the world from which the elves came. If we do it that way, we have to have at least those four already established. But if we make a change and we do something like Olean, the zombie apocalypse on Olean was the end of the world that the elves lived in. But I don't feel like that's the right path. I'd have to think about it a lot. Because in order for that to be the case, you would have to have Olean be a world before the apocalypse in which there were predominantly only elves, or at least an elvish empire that had the ability to span into other realms and explore. And somewhere along the way, they did something or encountered something that was so potentially destructive that it was eating and destroying their entire world. and left behind a world so devastated that it's really just on its way out. But if we build that world to be that way, they're not gone. And Kal-El the elf, Kal-Elf, I didn't even think of that one before, but the concept of Superman as an elf transported from the fairy realm to the superhero setting is one approach to this. But if that's done, then Kal-Elf is not the last one of his kind. If we're going to have Olean be the world from which he was sent, then Olean as a setting still has people scrabbling to survive against the infection of the zombie apocalypse that they're dealing with. I don't know what the right way to go with that is, and I'm going back and forth. There's a part of me that says, yeah, just buckle in whole hog, take it up and just go with it. Turn Olean into the world from which the Fae reached Sira and Orta. That means we still only have 3 developed, and we have the other 3 to play with to create other things. It's going to require some messing around with Olean to get some of the outcomes to go the way I want them to go. But those are the 3 primaries that I came up with to be offshoots of the Verloren realm. But here's the thing. As I've played with this and brainstormed over and over again, one of the things that occurs to me is that I made this setting concept to be modular so that you could swap in other universes. So if you really, really like the Eberron setting, you could swap out Sira and the Medusa storyline for just an Eberron setting. And if you do that, you could swap out any of the others as well. You could swap out all 6 subsettings to be something else, and it doesn't change the fact that they're subsettings into which you go when you're cast out of the Verloren realm. But there's a part of me that also says, like, okay, here's the thing. Each one of these, Olean, Sira, and Orta are worlds, but those worlds may have other planets. And so they're really more like universes. And those universes, in and of themselves, may contain other stories and other things going on in them. So you could very well have a setting in which you arrive on Olean, and on Olean you find a gateway that transports you to another planet in the Olean universe. So Mars to Olean's Earth. But here's what I'm struggling with. The other end of that spectrum is each one of the first mothers in the Verloren realm contains those universes. But here's a question. In the Verloren realm, we have continent, the main continent, and the smaller little island nations that orbit around it, and the capital city in the middle. And they float through a sky full of clouds, with a crackling ball of lightning energy above them that serves as their sun. And at night, when that ball of energy dims or shifts away, they can see a starry sky. Those stars may be other continents adrift in a sea of sky. And so those stars may be other islands and other continents. And there's a part of me feeling like some of those islands and some of those continents may have some of their own first mothers. And if that's the case, how does that change what we're doing with the rest of the stories? With the other worlds that they visit, instead of just the 6, there may be billions of other first mother worlds out there. But also, my tendency to look at those first mothers of Olian, Sira, Orta, Mira, Lumia, Dunia, they are all 6 of them going to have some presence in each of the worlds that we visit. So do they have 6 billion individual vestiges sown throughout the universe? And I think in story terms, the way I'm working around some of the happenstance, that if there are 6 billion worlds, when you die, you'd happen to be reincarnated to a specific world. The way I'm sort of dealing with part of that is making the circumstances by which the characters do some of that spiritual bonding I talked about the other day, where if you're on the world and you die, you're a spirit, you haven't left the world yet. And you can be anchored to that world through forming anchors to other beings or objects in that world. But if we massage the circumstances in such a way that a network of connections are built between the characters in that sense, then when it comes time to shift away from the Verloren realm into one of the sub-realms, you're likely to be able to keep them bound together. That's why they show up in the next world together. So there's a part of that I think I can get away with. This adds an additional aspect of, like, we set it up and we play it as these 6 realms with the 7th Valoran realm. But during the course of exploring and finding the key factors of finding the first mothers in the other realms and finding Valoran in those realms to find a way back through, and finding out who you are as a character and which vestige of yourself best represents the person you want to be going forward. Those are the 3 big factors. But now we're introducing a 4th factor in play. And that 4th factor is really just kind of uncovering the nature of the universe and realizing there's a whole multiverse of other worlds that you can explore. And there are a whole slew of other first mothers. And if those other first mothers are sort of native to other continents in the Valoran realm, then those first mothers, if you find one of them instead, you may show up on an entirely different continent than the one you started on. And those other continents can have entirely different social structures and conflicts going on. And so it makes the world so much bigger. But it also adds a little question here. Valoran being the first mother in which the Valoran realm resides, having her vestige figures appear in each of the worlds that our characters travel through. So if our characters travel through Olian, Sierra, Orta, Mira, Lumia, and Dunia, and in each of them they find some vestige, some fragment of Verloren, then if she is the one in which the Valoran realm Verloren realm resides, then she's going to have a presence in all universes that connect back to the central universe. And if that's the case, she's the billionfold goddess. She is she has a presence like, and it makes a little bit of sense. There's a part of me that says I can make that work because hey, I talked about it early on as if these vestiges, these beings that your mind ends up in these other worlds are like the cells of your body, where you can take a culture of them and they can continue to eat, grow, produce waste, and go about their life unaware of the fact that they're part of a greater organism like ourselves. But they can live independent of us, not knowing about us, and we don't think about them as a part of us. Each one of my cells, I'm not consciously aware of each of them. But now imagine yourself being shunted down into one of your cells, taking it over and being conscious as that cell. If I take that same philosophy, that same thought process behind this, and apply it to the first mothers, having vestiges of themselves in these other subsequent worlds, then Verloren has a vestige in all of them because she has to. For all the other worlds to be connected to the Verloren realm, she has to have a presence in each of them. It's sort of like, in this sense, every vestige, every physical form of Verloren in a different world is a mouth through which she can gobble up and swallow and bring into herself any living thing in that world. So she eats you in one world and you emerge inside the Verloren realm. So in order for that to be the case, there has to be one of her at least for every universe. So there's got to be billions of her. And where this is a little bit differently is there was a part of me that was wondering if you take somebody like Olian and take that same approach, is Olian the world or is Olian the universe? Because if you have, say, Olian the planet and you do a Mars next to Olian in one universe, is the Mars a different goddess from a different continent in the Verloren realm? The problem I have with that is it's a if you imagine Olian as a first mother and she birthed into the Verloren realm children from her own world within herself, then if you had another first mother on another continent who was the Mars of that universe, the ability for creatures from Mars to travel to Olian without passing through another reality, they're in the same universe, means that Olian and Mars are a shared womb? And that feels weird, and I'm having trouble getting over it. So I'll have to meditate on that a little bit. It's just these, and it's weird to describe to people that these are things. All of these things are things my brain came up with, and so I'm talking about them like I need to uncover the facts about the circumstance. Well, no, I've made all of these facts up, but it's about the consistency, internal consistency of a world build. And it feels wrong to push too hard in any given direction on that world build. to such a degree that it breaks down. I want my world to make enough sense, even if there's like magic and woo-woo mysticism in that universe. That's one thing. But I can't just wave off things that don't make sense, saying like, oh, well, this is all make-believe anyway. It doesn't matter. You can do that in certain types of world builds, certain imagination. Like Alice in Wonderland wanted to do that. Things don't make sense, and they don't ever want you to believe you can make them make sense. It's not about making sense. But my worlds don't go that way. They have very serious restrictions on themselves to do their best to not have gaping holes in their logic. It's not a fairy tale make-believe thing. You don't take a pile of snips and snails and puppy dog tails and assemble a young boy out of them. That is not your flesh golem. That is not how that works. And you don't assemble sugar and spice and everything nice and make a young woman. That's a great rhyme. It's a great imaginative fantasy play space for giggly stories. But you can't build a greater universe in which you can tell multiple stories. Now, well, I think the part of the reason that falls apart when doing a world build is it's Calvin Ball. And if you've ever read Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin Ball has that huge caveat of, well, you can't do that. Well, yes, I can. I made that rule up. Yeah. But that rule didn't exist 5 minutes ago, so you can't be winning because you've decided that getting hit in the shoulder by a ball instead of catching it gives you 5 extra points. That's not how, you can't just make that crap up and expect all the players to suddenly agree to those rules. And so, like, Calvin Ball is a horrible way to build the rules of your universe. And you can see it when somebody's done it like that. I'm trying to think I saw a movie not that long ago where somebody did something just like that, where something major happened, and they're like, well, it's a major emotional plot point, and it changes the course of events for the foreseeable future. And then, like, 15 minutes later, somebody comes along and undoes it and says, oh, no, well, see, there's this little trick that nobody's ever mentioned, never came up ever before. It solves the problem that this person, like, you've robbed us. You've robbed us at that point. And so I can't build worlds that do that. It bothers me too much to allow that to happen. Now, I'm not going to pretend I'm going to be able to predictably figure out all the little plot holes and plug them. I'm sure I'm going to leave something in there that somebody's going to come along at some point and go like, if this is this, then how does this happen? And I'm going to be like, oh crap. Well, yeah, technically, if you really look at it straightforward, that couldn't happen that way. But I wasn't thinking along those lines when I created everything. It's just the nature of world building. You're going to miss certain things. But I still feel the need to do my very best not to knowingly fix things by leaving holes. It's not fixing things. Anyway, we're bumping up on an hour here in a couple of seconds, so I'm going to probably call it here tonight. Hope you're doing all right. Hope it's not as hot there as it is here tonight. I'm not sure what tomorrow's going to look like, because I do know that I'm working a lot of extra shifts this week. I had almost none last week, and now I've got too many this week. But I will do my best to be back on here tomorrow night with some more thoughts. I may give a little more thought on my other worlds, the ones that I haven't talked about yet. But they're still kind of in the works. There's a lot of fiddling that's going on with that. I also may take the opportunity to talk about some other projects that I may want to end up doing. Sort of gotten the bug for indie film creation, and I kind of want to get back to some of my choose your own adventure style video concepts and some of my audio adventure stories that we worked on last year. So I may see about dabbling with some of that in the near future. We'll see where things go. I'm trying to find a better way to use my time so that I don't have so much of this scattered effort. But we're at a full hour tonight. I didn't think I was going to make 40 minutes, let alone an hour. Turns out if you give me the space to ramble about my topics, I can do a fair amount of rambling. So thanks for joining me for tonight. I hope you're doing well, and I hope to see you tomorrow night. And until then, take care and have a good night. I can't feel my toes anymore. I've been sitting too long. Gotta find a better chair. There's gotta be a better way to sit to do these. I might actually start standing if I can get the setup to do it. That'd be nice. So many things to maybe do sometime when I can, if it's possible. Stay cool.